The story begins with a man who had lived most of his life quietly, tending to the same soil his grandfather once walked. 3 generations had poured their blood, sweat, and tears into maintaining a 200-acre farmland, a piece of land that wasn't just dirt and grass, but a living history of family, tradition, and livelihood. It wasn't the kind of property tucked into suburbs or squeezed between rows of neatly painted homes. It was sprawling, open, and untouched by city hands, at least until the local homeowners association decided it had the authority to meddle. The HOA wasn't technically in charge of the farmland. Its jurisdiction stretched across a nearby, planned community of several hundred homes. The farmland lay beyond that, separated by fences, tree lines, and decades of clear boundary markers. But as the farmland grew in value, developers began whispering in ears, and the HOA saw an opportunity to make money where it had no business interfering. The man first learned something was wrong when he received a letter in the mail. The language was official, the tone smug. It stated that the HOA had approved the sale of his farmland to a development company that intended to build new luxury housing and amenities. Shock rolled over him like a tidal wave. He read it 3 times, convinced he was misunderstanding. The letter described the acreage in exact detail, his acreage, as if it were theirs to claim. Confusion quickly turned to anger. He called the county offices, double-checked property records, and confirmed what he already knew. His name was still listed as owner, his family's deed still locked in the county archives. The farmland wasn't for sale, never had been, and certainly wasn't under the HOA's jurisdiction. Yet somehow, the association had convinced developers and even certain officials that they had the right to sign it away. At first, he assumed it was an error, a clerical mistake. Some crossed wires between county records and the HOA's aggressive board. But as he began attending meetings and asking questions, the truth revealed itself. The HOA president, a smug woman with an iron grip over the neighborhood, had orchestrated everything. She argued that since the farmland bordered the community, it was logically part of it, and therefore subject to their decisions. She flaunted supposed bylaws that no one outside her circle had ever seen, and claimed it was her duty to protect the integrity and future of the community. It wasn't just arrogance, it was fraud. The man tried reasoning, pointing out property records, family deeds, and legal ownership. But every attempt was brushed off. Meetings ended with him being shouted down, accused of being a nuisance, even threatened with fines for trespassing on his own land. The HOA was so drunk on power they had convinced themselves they could rewrite reality. For months he fought. He hired lawyers, filed complaints, and brought county officials onto his side. But the HOA was cunning, using loopholes, delays, and manipulated paperwork to drag out the fight. And while he battled in offices and courtrooms, developers began staking claim to the edges of his farmland, posting survey markers and sending in trucks. To outsiders, it looked like a legitimate sale. To him, it was theft unfolding in slow motion. By the time he secured the first injunction, damage had already been done. Developers had carved dirt paths across the land, uprooted decades-old trees, and set up fencing. Some homeowners from the community even walked across the property as if it were a new park, bragging about how much their homes would increase in value once the new development was complete. The man stood there, watching strangers walk across, the soil his grandfather once tilled, feeling powerless in the face of arrogance. But the HOA had made a critical mistake. In their rush to secure power, they had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. They had signed fraudulent documents, claimed ownership over land that was never theirs, and publicly declared the farmland as community property. And while they thought they could bury him in paperwork and legal delays, the man had something they hadn't considered: patience, resources, and a deep, burning determination to make them regret every move. His attorneys discovered inconsistencies, falsified signatures, and blatant misuse of HOA funds. What's more, the so-called bylaws the HOA president claimed gave her authority didn't exist anywhere outside the documents she herself drafted. It was fraud layered on fraud, arrogance on top of arrogance. And once exposed in the right court, it wouldn't just unravel their scheme. It would open the entire HOA to liability. The man realized he had more than a chance to defend his land. He had an opportunity to strike back. The farmland wasn't just acres of soil anymore. It was leverage. By proving the HOA's actions were illegal, he could claim damages, massive ones. And since the HOA members had all signed contracts tying themselves to the association, the liability didn't just fall on the president or the board, it fell on every homeowner in that community. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The injunctions stuck. The developers backed away, and the county began investigating the HOA. But the damage was done. The HOA had tied itself to fraudulent sales, debts, and legal exposure. And as the lawsuits piled up, homeowners realized their property values weren't going to skyrocket. They were about to collapse. The man didn't stop there. Using the court's rulings and the HOA's own illegal contracts, he positioned himself to take something far more valuable than just revenge. Piece by piece, he began acquiring liens, foreclosures, and rights tied to the very homes of the people who had cheered when his farmland was stolen. The HOA had tried to illegally sell his land. Now he was legally preparing to sell theirs, and this was only the beginning. Once the court formally ruled the HOA had acted outside its authority, the man thought he would feel relief. And in a sense, he did. The farmland was safe, its deed preserved in the rightful name, and the developers who had arrogantly stepped onto his soil were forced to pull back. Heavy machinery was removed, survey stakes yanked out of the earth, and the false fences dismantled under court order. To the untrained eye, it looked like justice had been served. But underneath the surface, the damage the HOA had inflicted on itself was only beginning to spread. For the homeowners who had believed their property values would soar, reality began sinking in. Instead of more amenities and shiny new developments, they now faced headlines about lawsuits, fraud investigations, and potential criminal charges tied to their HOA board. Their neighborhood wasn't gaining prestige, it was gaining infamy. The man recognized this shift for what it was, an opportunity. He had watched them mock him, threaten him, and trespass across his land as if it were a shared playground. Now they were trapped in the very web their leaders had spun. The HOA board had drained funds for legal defenses, hired shady consultants, and committed to contracts they couldn't legally enforce. Their reckless arrogance had left the entire community financially vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, the man saw his revenge waiting to be harvested. Through his attorneys, he pursued damages for the illegal sale attempt. Not small damages, not token gestures, but full compensation for lost time, property disruption, legal fees, and fraudulent claims. The sum was staggering, far beyond anything the HOA could afford with its current reserves. The court agreed with his claims, and a judgment was issued. The HOA owed him more than it had ever collected in years of dues. With no way to pay outright, the HOA had only one option: pass the cost down to the homeowners. Special assessments were issued. Every household was notified that they owed thousands, in some cases tens of thousands, to cover the board's legal blunders. For many families, it was an impossible sum. Mortgages already stretched their finances, and now they were being forced to pay for crimes they hadn't personally committed. Anger spread through the community, but it didn't matter. The contracts they had signed when moving in bound them all to the association. Whether they liked it or not, they were on the hook. And this was exactly what the man had planned for. Foreclosure notices began trickling in. Some homeowners tried to resist, hiring lawyers of their own, but the binding nature of the HOA agreements crushed nearly every defense. Homes were seized, placed under lien, or sold off at auction. Each time, the man positioned himself as the buyer. He had resources, patience, and above all, the motivation to turn every misstep of the HOA into his gain. One by one, properties that once belonged to the very people who had cheered his misfortune began falling into his hands. He didn't even need to set foot in the community to make it happen. Paperwork and legal processes worked on his behalf, steadily transferring control of the neighborhood from the smug, arrogant collective that had tried to steal his farmland into his personal portfolio. The irony wasn't lost on him. These were the same people who had mocked him at HOA meetings, who had shrugged when surveyors drove stakes into his soil, who had smirked at the idea that their property values were about to skyrocket. Now their homes were being stripped away, not through fraud, but through lawful proceedings. Every property acquired was stamped with legitimacy, sealed by the very courts that had once seemed too slow to protect him. The HOA president, the architect of the entire debacle, fared no better. With mounting pressure from lawsuits, her personal assets became entangled in the fallout. She tried to spin narratives, blaming developers, blaming her board, blaming anyone but herself. But her name was on the fraudulent documents, her hand, in the misuse of HOA funds. She became the face of the scandal, despised not only by outsiders, but by her own neighbors who were forced to pay the price for her arrogance. The man didn't need to confront her directly. He let the system work, watching from a distance as her once pristine reputation crumbled. The same woman who had boasted of protecting community integrity now found herself drowning in debt, facing foreclosure notices of her own. By the end of that year, the balance of power had shifted entirely. What began as a desperate defense of his farmland had evolved into something much greater. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a property owner with increasing control over the very neighborhood that had tried to consume his land. Each home he acquired brought him closer to holding majority sway in the community, flipping the tables on those who had once declared him an outsider, and yet he wasn't finished. Revenge was not complete simply by taking what they had. Wanted them to feel the same helplessness he had endured when letters claimed his land as theirs. He wanted them to watch as their surroundings changed, as decisions were made not in their favor, but against them. With ownership came voting rights, and with voting rights came influence over the HOA itself. Slowly, deliberately, he positioned his holdings so that he could influence board elections. The very entity that had once tried to erase him from his own property was now within his grasp. But as he prepared to tighten his hold, a new complication arose. The remaining homeowners, those who had not yet lost their properties, began to push back, not against him directly, but against each other. Desperation set in. Some wanted to flee the community, to sell their homes before collapse dragged them under. Others clung to the illusion that things could return to normal, that the HOA could be repaired and the damage undone. The division fractured what little unity remained, and in that fracture, the man saw his next opening, because taking their homes was only one layer of revenge. The true satisfaction would come when he finally controlled the HOA itself. The same HOA that had once claimed his land as their own, and that moment was approaching faster than anyone realized. By the time the man had acquired several homes through foreclosure, the neighborhood was in chaos. The illusion of order that the HOA once carried had cracked wide open, and every fracture revealed just how weak their foundation had been. What was once a smug collective of homeowners rallying behind their iron-fisted president was now a crumbling community of bickering neighbors, lawsuits, and financial ruin. To outsiders, the decline was almost comical, but for those who lived there, it was devastating. Property values plummeted. Real estate listings sat unsold as word spread about the HOA's corruption and the massive debts tied to the community. And every homeowner meeting, once filled with self-congratulatory speeches about beautification projects and rising equity, devolved into shouting matches and finger-pointing. The man stayed quiet, watching, listening, and preparing. He knew that true victory didn't lie in simply acquiring their homes. It lay in stripping away their last illusion of control, the HOA itself. The same entity that had dared to claim his farmland now stood as nothing more than a fragile house of cards. And he had every intention of pulling it apart piece by piece. Ownership in the community came with more than property. It came with voting rights. And voting rights were the key to dismantling the empire that had been wielded against him. With every foreclosure, with every house he purchased, his influence grew. At first, his votes were a whisper, barely a presence in the crowded room. But as the months rolled on, the whisper became a voice, the voice became a force, and soon his presence could not be ignored. The tipping point arrived at the next board election. The president, still clinging to her position with the arrogance of someone who believed she could not be toppled, announced her intent to remain in power. She promised reform, transparency, and a fresh start for the community. But her words rang hollow. Neighbors who had once supported her now stared with cold resentment, knowing she was the reason they were drowning in debt. The man didn't even need to campaign. His quiet, steady presence, combined with the homes he now legally owned, gave him leverage she could not overcome. The vote was decisive. For the first time in years, the HOA's control slipped from the president's hands. She was ousted, removed not only from the board, but also from the very pedestal she had built for herself. And when the dust settled, the man, once mocked, as an outsider once dismissed as a nuisance, stood at the head of the HOA board. The irony was almost too perfect. The farmer whose land they had tried to steal now legally controlled their entire association, and he wasted no time making it clear that things were about to change. His first acts weren't loud or dramatic. They were surgical, precise, and devastating. He called for audits of HOA finances, exposing every misuse of funds, every fraudulent contract, and every shady payment the previous board had approved. What he uncovered shocked even him. The board had siphoned money for personal expenses, written checks to non-existent contractors, and buried invoices that had nothing to do with community upkeep. The fraud was deeper than anyone realized, and now it was all public record. Homeowners, who had once turned a blind eye to the president's actions, were forced to confront the truth. And with every revelation, their anger grew, not at him, but at the system they had allowed to fester. The man, in turn, positioned himself as both executioner and savior. He promised accountability, but accountability came at a price. Fees increased. Rules tightened. Inspections became relentless. Where once the HOA had hounded him about his farmland, now he turned their same obsessive scrutiny back on them. Grass too long? Fined. Fence an inch too high? Fined. Exterior paint fading? Fined. The homeowners had laughed when these rules were used against outsiders. Now they wept as the same chains tightened around their own necks, but the fines weren't, just for punishment. They were revenue. Revenue that the man funneled back into his legal claims and property acquisitions. Every dollar squeezed from the community was another weapon in his arsenal, another tool to slowly dismantle their comfort. The very system they had once wielded with smug superiority had become the knife carving away at their lives. The former president fared the worst. With her removal came a cascade of legal actions. She was sued personally for fraud, stripped of assets, and shunned by the very neighbors who once hailed her as a leader. The man didn't need to lift a finger against her. She was buried by the weight of her own lies. Her downfall became a cautionary tale whispered through the neighborhood. Don't cross the landowner, or you'll suffer the same fate. But the man wasn't driven only by revenge. As the months passed, he began to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about punishing those who had wronged him. It was about reclaiming power from a system designed to exploit ordinary people. The HOA had thrived on intimidation, on convincing homeowners that they were powerless against its decrees. Now he was proving the opposite, that with patience, strategy, and determination, the system could be turned against itself. And yet, even as he consolidated control, resistance brewed. Not everyone in the community accepted his rule. A small but vocal group of homeowners banded together, determined to push back. They accused him of being no better than the president he had replaced, of abusing the HOA for his own gain. They whispered about lawsuits, recalls, and appeals to county officials. The man knew they were desperate. He also knew desperation could be dangerous. What they didn't realize was that he had anticipated this. Every step he had taken, every move on the board, had been carefully documented and made within the bounds of the law. His actions weren't reckless. They were calculated. While the previous board had fallen due to fraud, his foundation was unshakable. Still, their resistance added fuel to his fire. It wasn't enough to simply control the HOA. He wanted to erase every trace of the arrogance they had once flaunted. And to do that, he would need to push even harder, because revenge wasn't complete until they had nothing left to cling to, not their homes, not their rules, not even the illusion of community pride. And so, with control of the HOA secured, he set his sights on the final phase of his plan, dismantling the community itself, house by house, family by family, until the very neighborhood that once tried to consume his farmland became nothing more than a ghost of its former self. Once the man secured control of the HOA board, the neighborhood shifted from a place of pride to a place of fear. Gone were the days of block parties, holiday decorations, and chatter about rising property values. In their place came silence, bitterness, and the constant weight of inspections, fines, and foreclosures. What had once been billed as a dream community was quickly unraveling into a cautionary tale. The man didn't need to be physically present for his plan to unfold. His power flowed through paper, policies, and procedures. Every rule the HOA had once written to intimidate outsiders became a weapon he now turned inward. It was poetic justice. They had cheered when letters arrived threatening him for trespassing on his own farmland. Now those same envelopes landed on their doorsteps, carrying notices of violations, demands for payment, and warnings of consequences. At first, the residents resisted. They appealed fines, argued with inspectors, and sent letters of protest. But one by one, their resistance crumbled. The bylaws they had once accepted without reading were airtight, designed to strip them of power. And because they had weaponized those bylaws against him in the past, the man now wielded them with flawless precision. There was no loophole to save them, no technicality to undo what they had signed years ago. Every violation, no matter how small, added up. A missed payment here, an overgrown bush there. Suddenly, families found themselves thousands of dollars in debt to the HOA. And when they couldn't pay, foreclosure proceedings followed. It wasn't quick and it wasn't always clean, but it was inevitable. The man's attorneys moved like hunters through tall grass, patient and methodical, waiting for each misstep before striking. The neighborhood began to empty. Once occupied homes stood silent, curtains drawn, driveways bare. For sale signs appeared on lawns, though few buyers were willing to touch a community drowning in scandal. Property values collapsed further. Homes that had once been worth hundreds of thousands sold for pennies on the dollar, and the man was there to claim them. The former HOA president's downfall accelerated the collapse. Her bankruptcy hearings became public spectacle, drawing local media and further staining the community's reputation. Homeowners who had once admired her leadership now spoke of her with venom, blaming her for their ruin. But in truth, her arrogance was only part of the destruction. The rest came from the man's quiet, relentless strategy. And still, he wasn't satisfied. Owning their homes and their association wasn't enough. He wanted them to experience the same helplessness he had endured, the feeling of watching something you love, something you believed was secure, be stolen from beneath your feet. He began dismantling the community from the inside. Maintenance budgets were slashed. Landscaping projects were canceled. Pools, parks, and clubhouses fell into disrepair. Where once children played and families gathered, weeds grew tall and fences sagged. The proud image of the neighborhood, polished and pristine, decayed with each passing week. The man didn't do this out of neglect. He did it deliberately, making sure every homeowner saw the consequences of their own arrogance. They had built their pride on the illusion of control, on the idea that their rules gave them superiority. Now those same rules chained them to a sinking ship, and he was the captain steering it straight into the rocks. Desperation spread like wildfire. Some families fled, abandoning their homes to foreclosure rather than endure the suffocating grip of the new HOA leadership. Others stayed, clinging to the hope that something might change, that the county might intervene or a court might undo what had been done. But no rescue came. The system was working exactly as it was designed to. The only difference was that the man now controlled it. Rumors swirled about his next moves. Some whispered that he intended to bulldoze the entire community, to erase it completely and expand his farmland across their ruined lots. Others speculated that he would convert it into rental properties, turning former homeowners into tenants who would pay him monthly rent to live in houses they once thought they owned. Whatever his plan, one thing was certain. The neighborhood they had once taken pride in was gone, and it would never return. And through it all, the man felt a grim satisfaction. He remembered the letter he had received months earlier, the one smugly declaring that the HOA had approved the sale of his farmland. He remembered the laughter, the arrogance, the looks of superiority when he had tried to defend what was his. Now those same people avoided his gaze, their voices hushed, their pride broken. Yet as powerful as he felt, the man knew the story wasn't over. Taking their homes, seizing their association, and dismantling their community was only part of his revenge. There was still one step left, one final act that would seal his victory and ensure they never forgot the cost of crossing him. Because to truly erase the arrogance of the HOA, he wouldn't just leave their neighborhood in ruins. He would transform it into something that stood as a permanent reminder of their downfall. And as he prepared for that final move, the last families remaining in the community began to realize the truth. Their fight wasn't just against fines or foreclosures anymore. Their fight was against a man who now owned not just their homes, but their futures. The community had tried to consume his farmland. Now he was preparing to consume the community itself. The neighborhood was no longer a neighborhood. What had once been a polished community of smiling faces and manicured lawns had transformed into something hollow. Driveways sat empty, windows were boarded, and the once proud HOA signage stood rusted, tilted, and forgotten. It wasn't simply a collapse. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling, orchestrated by the very man they had tried to erase. The farmland owner had achieved everything he had set out to do. His property was secured, his family's legacy intact. More than that, he had acquired home after home, stripping the residents of their greatest pride and turning their rules into shackles that dragged them under. He controlled the HOA, directed its policies, and oversaw its downfall with the same patience he once used to tend crops in his fields. But in his mind, there was still unfinished business. Revenge was about more than punishment. It was about permanence. He didn't want the memory of what had happened to fade with time. He wanted it carved into the ground, impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. And so, he began the final phase of his plan. The properties he had acquired were not left to rot. Piece by piece, house by house, he sold them off, but not to families or homeowners. Instead, he sold them to investors and developers who had no interest in preserving the neighborhood. One parcel became storage facilities. Another became farmland extensions, fenced and folded into his original 3,200 acres. Several homes were demolished entirely, their remains hauled away until nothing but open fields remained. The residents who had stayed until the bitter end were forced to watch as the neighborhood dissolved around them. Where once children rode bicycles, trucks now carried away rubble. Where pools had sparkled under the sun, weeds rose through cracked concrete. And where an HOA board once lorded over the community with arrogance and threats, nothing remained but empty lots and silent streets. The man didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. He simply worked, steady and methodical, until the transformation was complete. His farmland, once endangered by their greed, now stretched further than it had in generations. The HOA had tried to consume his legacy, but instead, he had consumed theirs. When the last home was sold, the HOA dissolved. Legally, it ceased to exist, bankrupt, powerless, and irrelevant. The very entity that had once declared authority over his land was erased from county records, its bylaws archived as nothing more than evidence of fraud and corruption, and with its disappearance, so too vanished the arrogance of the people, who had once wielded it. In time, outsiders drove past what was left of the community and shook their heads. They whispered about the ghost neighborhood, about the farmer who had destroyed an HOA from the inside out. Some saw it as legend, others as warning. But for those who had lived through it, the story needed no embellishment. They had lost everything: homes, reputations, security, all because they had followed leaders too arrogant to admit they were wrong. The man didn't need recognition. His victory wasn't for headlines or applause, it was for his family, for the generations who had tilled the soil before him, and for the principle that no one could take what was rightfully his. His farmland stood untouched, stronger than ever, a testament to resilience against greed, and perhaps most satisfying of all, he knew that the HOA's collapse would echo far beyond his land. Other communities, other associations, other arrogant boards would hear the story. They would think twice before overstepping, before convincing themselves they had power where they did not. Because now there was proof of what could happen when an HOA picked a fight with the wrong person. In the end, he hadn't just defended his farmland. He had rewritten the balance of power. He had turned their greed into his leverage, their rules into his tools, their arrogance into their downfall. And in doing so, he had delivered a final, undeniable truth. When you try to steal a man's legacy, you risk losing your own.